So, good afternoon to everyone in Europe, and good morning to people on the other side of the Atlantic. I warm welcome from the Center for the Study of Democracy in Sofia. My name is Juan Stefanov, and I'm the program director for CSD, and I'm joined today by our panel of journalists from the Washington and Paris, actually from the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post, put together by my colleague John Bussey, who will be moderating this session today for a third time. This is the third in a row, and I very much look forward to what our experts today have to say about the latest President Trump nominations for positions of power in the U.S. Definitely, everyone has been following what's been going on, and I'm very proud that we were able to focus both on Russia in the past and also China, and now we're focusing on what's likely to be the fallout of these latest nominations. And I'm certain that all of you are glued to what's going on. I was just looking at the meeting of foreign ministers in NATO and the EU. Essentially, one of the same things comes out. We just sit and wait. We wait to see what's going to come at us. And it seems that there's been a widely expected move towards more loyal, Trump-loyal people being appointed, which seems to indicate some sort of clarity. But at the same time, it also seems to indicate that it will be the President Trump's final word, which makes it even more unpredictable. So it would be great to hear from our panelists today what they think about these issues. We rightly called it what the fallout might be on the U.S. engagement globally, and particularly in the fault lines. We've seen, of course, number one, the war in Ukraine, Russia's aggressive war in Ukraine. Then we've seen also the Hamas atrocities and Israel's war in Gaza. Now, yesterday evening, we saw another kind of Cold War fault line, kind of re-flicker, if I could use that word, in South Korea, where we saw a sort of a 2.5-hour coup, that weirdly went into history by the word of Parliament. So it's really interesting whether you see any connection to, what's been going on at the Department of Defense, let's say, with the seemingly changing nominations in Europe. And I'm finishing with that. We've been overly focused on of course, the nominations for the Department of State with Marco Rubio, and of course the Special Envoy General Kellogg. And I would love to hear more about your thoughts on that. And of course, Department of Defense, but also sanctions and tariffs. So who will be sitting at the Treasury Department, and what are we likely to see coming? Now, without much ado, I would like to pass the floor to my colleague John Bussey, who is also associate editor at the Wall Street Journal. He has served as deputy editor-in-chief in Washington, bureau chief, foreign editor, economics editor, Tokyo bureau chief, Asia chief based in Hong Kong, and I'd love to hear his kind of brief comment also what we saw in South Korea, and also he's been a reporter in the U.S. in Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit bureaus. As he was foreign editor, the international stuff won 3 Pulitzer Prizes. John, thanks a lot for putting this together, and please give us your tea leaf reading. I look forward to a really lively debate. For our audience, welcome again, and please actively put your questions in the chat, and John will make sure to ask them or will interject. John, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Ruslan, thank you very much. Thanks also to the Center for the Study of Democracy for holding this panel. And please do put your comments or put your questions in the chat queue. We'll try to get to those after maybe 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes of conversation. Lee Hochstedter's at the Washington Post. He's the European columnist for the Washington Post, watching Europe and its politics. and economics and many other topics. Aaron Zitner is an editor and reporter in the Washington bureau of the Wall Street Journal. He's been there for about 15 years, very senior correspondent for us, and has covered politics also for the Los Angeles Times before joining the Wall Street Journal. So let's get underway. Aaron, just from a macro standpoint, before we get into the details of some of the Trump picks for his cabinet, what's the overall trajectory tell you about this administration and what its priorities are going to be?
Well, when it comes to the nominees, first of all, thank you for having me, and hello to everyone near and far. I'm in Washington, and it's great to be part of such an international and esteemed group here. When it comes to the picks themselves, we could divide them in many different buckets, loyalists and newcomers, people who had roles in Trump's first term, people who were involved in the impeachment proceedings. But for our purposes, let's just think about two buckets. One would be the disruptors, and one would be the guardrails. Clearly, some of these picks are here, they haven't formally been nominated yet. They can't be till he's president, but he's identified who he wants. They're here to break things and to change things. I'm thinking of Pam Bondi as the Attorney General, Kash Patel as head of the FBI, Tulsi Gabbard at the spy agencies, Pete Hegseth or whoever replaces him as the nominee for the Defense Department. They're there to make really big changes. What Democrats fear is some of them are there to exact retribution, to execute personal vendettas that Trump has against individuals through the criminal justice system. They're the disruption part. And then there are guardrails. If Donald Trump has any corrective mechanism to rein him in, it's the markets. And Scott Bessent is the nominee for the Treasury Department. He seems largely there to make sure that the markets and the economy don't go south on Donald Trump. And Marco Rubio at State, who's a fairly conventional pick, who is a deep experience in government and whose foreign policy views have evolved over time, but seem fairly well within the mainstream of conventional Republican thinking, and we can talk further about that. So that's how I would divide them for our purposes, as people who are here to break things and people who are here to kind of keep a guardrail on the most important things that Trump cares about, which are the economy and international relations.
Lee, how's that framework gonna sit with nations in Europe?
Well, the most pressing question that Europe is facing is what Trump will do on Ukraine, and really it's anybody's guess. You could take some comfort in the appointment of, if he's confirmed, of Marco Rubio at State, or of Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, and as Aaron said, assume, yes, these are relatively conventional Republicans who in the past have expressed to one degree or another support for Ukraine, although Marco Rubio voted against the most recent package of aid. Or you could be worried, if you were European, about what Tulsi Gabbard, as national intelligence, or Pete Hegseth or whoever at the Pentagon might do with Ukraine. It's going to force the question on Europe. If the United States decides to depart from the Biden line on Ukraine, which is to do as much as it can for as long as it can, that's going to force a question on Europe. Can Europe step in? What can Europe do? Because the choice is fairly stark. Reach some sort of an accommodation with Russia, which is not where mainstream Europe has been or wanted to be. But in the absence of, the United States' military heft, in the absence of a full commitment in Washington to NATO, Europe's going to face a really dire question. Can it fill in for what the United States' role has been in Ukraine and at NATO for that matter, which would probably mean doubling defense budgets, going from 2% in the case of some, but not all, European allies, to 2% of GDP spent on defense, to going to 3 or 4%, which would mean an enormous tax increase, huge new debt, or an enormous shift of social spending to military spending, from butter to guns. None of those would be welcome choices. And so I think the most fundamental challenge facing Europe is whether the Trump presidency will exert a sort of galvanizing effect, where the Europeans see that the United States is departing the field, pivoting to Asia, and that it's incumbent on Europe to kind of come together, rally, and in a much more coherent and resolute way, join forces to support Ukraine, and join forces as an economic bloc as well. Or will the Trump effect be to atomize Europe, to prompt various European leaders and countries to seek their own special deals with Trump? Of course, this is what Trump would prefer, and that's where the pressure from Washington will be. So it's really going to be a moment of truth, I think, from Washington, and we'll see.
Doesn't the threat
I'm going to take the liberty to interrupt. Since we're on Marco Rubio, could we pause there for a minute? I'm no real expert in his foreign policy, but there are two things that are worth putting on the table. It's true that he did vote against the most recent tranche of money for Ukraine, but he also voted for, and I think co-sponsored, legislation that was successful that said that the president can't unilaterally withdraw from NATO, that it takes an act of Congress to approve withdrawal from NATO. I think that's a very important signal of his impulses. And a second one that your audience might not appreciate is right now, Democrats control the Senate, but a few years ago, Republicans controlled the Senate. And during that time, Marco Rubio was the chairman of a subcommittee, I think it was the Small Business Subcommittee. And he used that position to flesh out a very serious policy agenda for countering China. And it was a very detailed industrial policy in which he said there are 10 advanced industries that are important to the United States: advanced high-speed shipping, advanced material science, semiconductors. And these are important to the US for strategic purposes because we can't allow China to dominate them, and because when jobs are created in these high-tech, science-intense industries, they're good jobs. They're high-wage jobs with a multiplier effect in our economy. And he put a lot of effort into white papers into how the United States should organize itself and what the incentives should be for businesses and the government to come together to support these industries. And I mention that because Trump is the tariff man. His way of conducting foreign policy and protecting jobs at home is through the instrument of tariffs. But he's chosen in a Secretary of State someone whose impulses are also a different way forward, which is through industrial policy and government investment and incentives in industries. And it'll be interesting to see how that comes into play as the tariff portion of foreign policy comes to the fore. And it's already coming to the fore.
Aaron,
Lee,
on your first point on Marco Rubio, who sponsored that legislation with Tim Kaine, Democrat of Virginia, it suggests that his instincts are what I'd be very happy with: traditional American support for NATO. I think it's important to keep in mind, though, that for the United States to render NATO impotent, it doesn't need to withdraw. It simply needs a few more flip comments from Donald Trump about how he's not going to support militarily, or not going to defend militarily, any kind of incursion from the Russians. Formal membership in NATO or not for the United States really doesn't matter. A few more comments, and Article 5, which commits the United States to mutual defense in Europe, Article 5 becomes an empty construct. And Trump has already done great damage to it. Article 5, this measure of the original NATO treaty, establishing mutual defense, an attack on one country is an attack on all, is like the dollar. And it's a cliche, so I apologize, but I'm going to repeat it. It's only as good as people's faith in it. In other words, any comment from the President of the United States, or the President-elect of the United States, or the candidate who's running for President of the United States and wins, that diminishes Article 5, does enormous damage. And many people around Trump have talked not about withdrawal from NATO, but about leaving NATO dormant. In other words, turning its back on NATO. And that's enough. That's enough to encourage Putin to continue what he's been doing. Putin's interest is in breaking NATO, which means rendering it not credible as a defensive alliance. Likewise, with the European Union, Russia found itself not thriving in a world in which there was guaranteed norms that the West had set, and so he did what he did. Putin did what he did, and if NATO is a diminished force, which is possible, but we'll see, I think it's very fair to assume that Putin will keep pushing, and that I think is the essential dynamic.
And to your point, Lee, when Trump made that famous comment saying that he would let Russia do whatever the hell it wants if the NATO countries don't put up money, my recollection is that Marco Rubio defended that comment and didn't challenge that comment. So,
like so many Republicans, bending the knee and kissing the ring and failing to stand up for their own previous positions.
And it's notable that he has appointed Matthew Whitaker to be ambassador to NATO, somebody without any foreign policy, background. What exactly is that, signaling? Lee, back on your comment that Ukraine is at the top of the list for Europe. Tariffs and the threat of have got to be a very, very close second at this point. 10 to 20% tariffs. He's already said, I'm going to put that on Europe. That has got to contribute, I would imagine, to not galvanizing, as you were postulating, the possibility of a coherent Ukraine, program, but the atomization of the relationship with Europe, where every country is going to be seeking its own special accommodation under a new tariff regime.
Well, we'll see, and we'll see how serious Trump is. Quite possible that the 10 to 20% threat is just a threat. It's an opening negotiating position. Remember, the other guy gets to vote too, and the European Union is responsible, has the remit for trade policy. And so under the umbrella of the European Union, it's plausible. And Ursula von der Leyen is an extremely strong head of the European Union, that she could forge some kind of united front to push back on tariffs. Tariffs cut both ways, and European Union tariffs on American products is a cudgel that the European Union could wield against Trump. So I think you'll see a negotiation. I wouldn't want to predict, how that's going to come out, how serious Trump is, but I agree with you that, plenty of leaders, from Keir Starmer on down and on east, could very well seek their own special pleadings with Donald Trump in trade negotiations. And it comes at a time when Europe is weaker than it's been in many years. You've got a political meltdown in France, which we can talk about later. You've got
a vote this evening on a confidence vote,
right, in which the government could fall. You've got the government in Germany having already disintegrated, and new elections coming up there in a few months. Both countries weak in all sorts of ways. French debt out of control. The German industrial might really crumbling. Both countries, as well as others in Europe, underperforming the United States, and according to almost any economic metric for many years now. So it's Trump flexing his muscles against Europe at an extraordinarily weak time in Europe.
Aaron, back on your two buckets of where these cabinet nominations, as well as not just cabinet nominations, but heads of various departments and deputies in various departments that are not cabinet level, but that are still crucial to how the U.S. governs and how it might influence Europe and the rest of the world. I think you were being charitable, if I might say, in calling the second bucket disruptors. Look, there are indications of certain competence in some of the choices. Marco Rubio at State might be one of them. Kevin Hassett as the economic advisor to the White House. Michael Waltz, national security advisor. But then there are some true oddities and unqualified loyalists that are just evidently, unqualified. Pete Hegseth at Defense, he was a major in the Minnesota National Guard. he might be qualified to become a lieutenant colonel in the Minnesota National Guard, but to run the Defense Department of the U.S., the Journal has a scoop today saying that Trump may be considering DeSantis to replace Hegseth. RFK Jr. at Health, a vaccine denier. Tulsi Gabbard at the Defense as a director of national intelligence, as a DNI director. She is a kind of an apologist for Putin. These are loyalists first and then competence second. And I'm wondering, with the House and with the Senate, at this point, the House and the Senate in control of the Republicans, but just by narrow margins, can we expect Congress? The Senate has to confirm these picks, but can we see Congress as some type of organization to shake out the incompetence from the qualified?
Well, two thoughts come to mind. The first is that a lot of Republicans, in good faith, think federal bureaucracy is too big and has to be reformed. And I think there are a lot of Democrats who agree. And the rap on what Trump is doing is, if you really want to reform the Pentagon and you really think there's waste there and money that can be recouped and strategy that needs to be fixed, and maybe you also want to, pursue this agenda of diminishing diversity at the expense of, if you really believe that commitment to diversity is sacrificing American military readiness, if you really are serious about making change in that agency, why pick a guy like Pete Hegseth, who, as a former senator, Judd Gregg told me, it's going to take that guy 2 years to find out where his desk is in that bureaucracy. If you really want to make change, you got to put someone in there who knows how the games are played.
You would think.
To take a step back, John, the way I think about it is, this is a time where Trump is testing every institution in government. He's going to the Senate and saying, you have the constitutional authority to confirm my nominees, but I want you to give that up. And I want you to just wave some of these nominees through without the advice and consent process, to put them in through what are called recess appointments. I want you to give up one of your constitutional powers. He's going to the House and to the Senate and saying, you have the power of the purse in our government. All spending power resides with you. I want you to give that up. My intent is to overturn a law called the Impoundment Act. And I reserve the right to not spend the money that you tell me to spend. And I reserve the right to move money around as I see fit. That is undermining an essential power of Congress. He has said, I should have more authority at the Fed, and maybe I want a different Fed chairman. And what is the Federal Trade Commission and the FCC that regulates communications? Those are independent agencies, and he says, why are they an unelected branch of government here? He's going after the military chain of command and saying, you might have a chain of command there that's been vetted by the military and confirmed by the Senate, but I'm going to form a special committee to review all the top generals, and I'm going to remove the ones who I don't like. And then he's gone to the press, and he has sued already, filed lawsuits against the Washington Post and CBS and ABC, I believe. And he said, maybe I'll try to revoke the broadcast licenses of some of these broadcasters who I don't like. He is testing every other element of power. Anyone who holds a lever of power in Washington is being pushed by him, the net result being power would accrue to the Oval Office and power would flow only from Trump himself as president. And when we come to these nominees, I think some of them may be intentionally weak or not people who have, they're not people who have their own independent power. I know Matt Gaetz had no independent power base other than loyalty to Trump. Pete Hegseth has no power base in the Republican Party. His loyalty is only to Donald Trump. And so he's appointing people in some of these cases who seem to be part of this agenda of pushing back against the powers and independence of every other institution in Washington for the purpose of concentrating power in the White House.
Two more aspects to that, Aaron, which I know you're well aware of, but I think bear mentioning. Number one, nominating a new director of the FBI 3 years before the current director's term is up. They're supposed to have 10-year terms. That's the tradition. So he would be firing or forcing the resignation of the current FBI director. So that's another guardrail question in a very key institution, the FBI, which of course Trump has a real grudge against, and his threat to reach far down into the bureaucracy, into the civil service, by eroding those civil service protections, and going to war against what he calls the deep state. In other words, way below the political level, to professional career bureaucrats, which could happen in absolutely any agency of government across Washington and beyond. That itself is a sort of fundamental institutional guardrail question.
Well, and he's appointed 2 billionaires to execute that plan. Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, who have been told, clean house. And with the cleaning of the house goes the technocrats, as you say, lead the career civil service folks who are meant to be guardrails. Aaron, what? I'm sorry?
And meant to be nonpartisan.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And the court system, in his first term, he instilled a conservative majority, 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court. So to the degree that the courts are going to say what is legal and not legal in Trump's efforts to accrue power and diminish the power of other institutions, he has a Supreme Court that has shown great deference to him so far.
So, Aaron, what are the guardrails to protect the American system, to protect democracy in the United States? We saw them tested. We saw those guardrails tested to the bent, certainly bent almost to the point of breaking, I think, in the first term. Bill Barr receiving the Mueller report. Yes, there was no Russia involvement. But here, says Mueller, are 10 instances of obstruction of justice by Donald Trump. Bill Barr, Attorney General appointed by Trump, tossing those aside and simply saying we're not going to consider those. That was a substantial bend in the guardrails of an independent judiciary justice system in the United States. What are the guardrails that are going to, other than the stock market you mentioned, which I think we should come back to, what are the guardrails that are going to keep this administration in line?
Well, we'll have to see. The Senate rejected Matt Gaetz. They look like they're on the verge of rejecting Pete Hegseth. We don't know if Tulsi Gabbard is viewed so much as sympathetic to Putin that she's going to be unacceptable. So the Senate is showing some independence. But what hasn't yet to play out yet is that there's a co-president in Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, who is already out there threatening that senators who vote against Trump's nominees or don't do what Trump wants will have a lot of money put up against them in the next time they run for office, and they'll be defeated. So you have a financial dagger hanging over every senator in the form of Elon Musk. And we have the courts, and we don't know what the courts will do. But Donald Trump has just beaten the court system. He had 4 sets of indictments brought against him for criminal activity, and they're essentially moot at this point. He has a Supreme Court that issued a ruling in the past year or so that said that presidents have very broad immunity from official acts in government, which gives Donald Trump a lot of license to do who knows what. The other guardrail out there, if it's not the courts and it's not the markets and it's not the independence of Congress, are the voters. And your audience should appreciate that, not just to think in 4-year terms, but in 2-year terms. And the 2024 election hit a record in American politics in this sense. It was the 6th election in a row, 6, in which voters changed which party is in control of either the House, the Senate, or the White House. 6 elections in a row, presidential election, midterm, presidential, midterm. One of the main levers of power has flipped from one party to the other. We've never had that in American history. It is a record of political disruption and voters really swinging back and forth. And this marks 9 elections out of 10 where one of the main institutions in Washington has had a change in party control. And this is one of those facts that are too good to check, but I'm told that you have to go back to the 1880s or 1890s to find the previous time that 9 out of 10 elections produced a change in party control. Moreover, the House that's coming in will be the 3rd House in a row where the party that controls the House has a single-digit majority. This House is going to be an exceedingly thin Republican majority. I think it's now going to be 220 to 215, which means that Republicans can only lose 2 members to get something passed out of 220. And because some of the members of the House have been appointed or nominated for higher office temporarily, the margin's going to be even thinner. This is just a way of saying in 2 years, there's likely to be a change here. Voters show a very strong appetite for changing their minds from election to election. And if I were a Republican in office, I would think that I have only 2 years to get done whatever I need to get done.
Another aspect of that, which Aaron and John, you're well aware of, is that, well, in Europe, I'm frequently asked, gee, we thought you Americans had an independent Department of Justice, or we thought you had this, or we thought you had that. And the truth is that in many cases, these norms are established not by the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that talks about the independence of the Department of Justice. There's nothing in law that establish that. These are norms that are established by tradition. Tradition seem to be sort of given, seem to be something set in stone for many years. The Department of Justice's independence was a tradition firmly established after Watergate, so that's 50 years ago. But presidents can overturn tradition rather easily. And this is where Trump's angle of opportunity is, in attacking tradition rather than law or Constitution.
That's a very, very important point from Lee. Trump has shown us how much of American governance runs on goodwill. And we see that. I mean, the one that comes to mind is a lot of presidents, when they leave office and they take all their boxes of stuff with them, they take records that they should have left behind that really are owned by the public and have national security implications. And Trump took a whole bunch of them. But when he was found to have them, he wouldn't give them back, and he claimed them to be his. That was just one of many examples that show that there's goodwill in the system, that it lives between the cracks of the letter of the law. And Trump just keeps exposing again and again how much, as Lee was saying, norms and traditions are important in American government, and someone like Trump can just ignore that.
Lee, there are politicians, fanboys and fangirls of Donald Trump and wannabes in Europe. This behavior, this signaling of disruption in the United States, this particular political trajectory in the US, does it change the political landscape in Europe? Does it galvanize voters to be afraid of that sort of thing and push them away from the Trump wannabes? Does it attract them more to them? What does it do?
Well, certainly, the fanboy in chief in Hungary, Mr. Orban, is popping his champagne corks. But there are other sort of below that surface interesting questions. For example, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who is from a right-wing tradition, even her party born out of the ashes of Italian fascism, and yet has been a relatively mainstream leader of a G7 country in Europe. She's been rhetorically completely behind support for Ukraine. And now, Donald Trump is in office. She's been quite close to members of Trump's circle, including Steve Bannon, Elon Musk. And so what does Giorgia Meloni do now? Will she continue her rhetorical, and I say rhetorical because Italy hasn't done much in military terms for Ukraine, but the rhetorical support of a major G7 leader is important. Will she continue her support for Ukraine or not? There are smaller figures like Robert Fico in Slovakia, somebody running for president in the Czech Republic, this new Romanian leader who emerged in the first round of presidential elections the other day. Yes, you do see obviously a populist surge in Europe, right-wing populist surge, whose issues are very close to Trump's. Whether their tone, whether they start behaving like Trump, is another question. So far, most haven't. You don't get this kind of the vulgarization of political rhetoric that Trump has been a champion of hasn't spread very widely in Europe, although the issues on which the Trump forces and the right-wing populist forces in Europe are ascendant, are very similar. Immigration, for starters.
The democratic guardrails in the U.S. have bent. What do you see as, I don't know, the corollary guardrails in Europe, and whether or not they are strong enough to resist some of this kind of movement toward authoritarianism, toward autocracy?
Well, the most important test case in that regard so far has probably been, well, aside from Hungary, in Poland, which is a much bigger and much more consequential country. And there you had years of leadership by a party that bent and in some cases pretty much broke guardrails, starting primarily with the judiciary in Poland, which the ruling Law and Justice then ruling Law and Justice Party took over, changed the rules, packed the courts, and after PiS's defeat, the Law and Justice Party's defeat in Poland a year ago, it's been extremely difficult to undo. In other words, that's a very interesting case in point. Once you break these institutions, or once you bend them severely, the judiciary in the case of Poland, putting it back together the way it was is not just a matter of a new government coming into office. The laws and rules and institutions that govern the courts and judiciary in Poland were so cooked by the preceding government. It's proved extremely difficult for Donald Tusk's new government to undo that and bring back the status quo ante. In other words, the broader point, once you break something, very hard to restore what were considered to be democratic norms. So, we'll see. In Hungary, they've already gone a long way down that same path towards the judiciary being non-independent, almost complete control of what had been a fairly robust independent press and media pre-Orban. And so, you'll start to see, I think, more and more of these tests as time goes on, and these populist right-wing parties are ascendant in Europe.
And one more question about NATO. Also, if there are any questions from our audience, if you would like to ask our panel, please put your questions in the chat queue, and we'll get to those in just a minute. Back on NATO for a second. Donald Trump's not the first one to say that Europe's not pulling its weight, right? That Europe is operating under the security umbrella of the United States. The U.S. taxpayer is picking up the tab for that, and that allows the budget meisters in Europe to spend the money on politically more attractive programs such as social welfare programs. Why it's so nice to live in Europe. Go to the dentist for 50 euros, not 500 in New York City. He's not the first to make the complaint. How does Europe get around that issue? How does it politically satisfy the expectations, the growing expectations that that nations within Europe increase their defense budgets without having to contend with the political problems that would create?
Extremely difficult to square that circle. Here's the math. NATO's current expectation, which is a minimum, is that countries spend 2% of GDP on their own defense. Of the about 2/3 of the members of Europe of NATO have reached that milepost, but many of them just barely, with the exception of Poland, which is way above it, and the Baltics. Most countries are either right around 2% or trying to get towards it. But in the case of others, especially in Southern Europe, and also Germany, if you take away a special fund, they're nowhere near 2%. And so the politics are, in order to fulfill NATO's own military planning, in order to afford what NATO's own generals are planning in order to guarantee the defense of Europe, most countries would have to go from 2 to 3% or even beyond 3% of GDP spending on defense. The United States is at about 3.3%. And that is political suicide, because it means either raising taxes a lot, piling up debt, which some countries don't even have the mechanism to do, and I'm talking about Germany principally, or this enormous shift that you referenced from butter to guns. And any of those things would be regarded by most European political leaders as political suicide. And so how then does Europe grapple with the question of defending itself in the absence of the United States? And just to look at the math again for a second, if you look at all military spending, all defense spending by all 32 NATO members, the United States accounts for about 2/3 of that. One country of 32 amount. Now, of course, all of that military spending by the United States is not directed at Europe, so it's a bit of a false construct. Nonetheless, without American weapons, without American defense industry, without American logistics, and without American intelligence, the European military apparatus is largely impotent. And so in order for it to be something more than that, there's just no choice. There has to be a lot more defense spending in Europe. But how do you get to that without those leaders, those European leaders, committing political suicide? And I don't think anybody's got an answer for that.
So we touched on China. Before we get to questions, I want to touch on one topic that we haven't touched on, which is climate. This is a president that pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Accords. It's called climate change a hoax. He's got some of his advisors affirming, the cause of climate change, and others denying it. Aaron, what is this administration likely to do when you look at the cabinet, when you look at its complexion? What is this administration likely to do on addressing climate change?
Well, Trump ran on the slogan, which I think came from Rudy Giuliani originally, of drill, baby, drill. He promised, either accurately or not, that the way he could bring prices down, I mean, inflation, like in many countries around the world, was the top political problem here and was corrosive to Joe Biden. And Trump said that one of the key ways he would bring prices down is by expanding energy production, and he would lift Joe Biden's pause on liquid natural gas exports and speed up permitting of drilling. The issue is no one wants to do any drilling around here. Prices are so low that the extraction companies and fracking companies have suspended new drilling, and they want prices to come up. So he is going to push for energy expansion. He ran against electric vehicles and said they were going to undermine automobile jobs and substitute union jobs for non-union jobs. But the truth is that several of the big pieces of legislation that Joe Biden got through in his first 2 years, one of them created very, very big incentives in the solar battery and electric vehicle space, solar panel and battery space for electric vehicles. And we've seen pretty meaningful investments in battery and plants and semiconductors and other industries, many of them related to climate. And a whole lot of this, the majority, went into districts around the country represented by Republicans. And so Republicans have a vested interest in maintaining government support for batteries and solar panels and other components that are part of the transition to a green economy. And in fact, we saw just a few weeks ago, the Speaker of the House was up in upstate New York, appearing with a congressman, and said, we want to repeal some of these laws. And the Republican congressman standing next to him said, wait a minute, I've got a big plant going up in my district because of these laws. I don't want to repeal them. Even some of the most noteworthy Republican antagonistic voices out there, like you might have heard of Marjorie Taylor Greene, she has a giant plant going into her district as a result of this climate change law that Joe Biden signed into law when he had Democratic Congress. She doesn't want to unwind that plant, I'm sure. So some of these things that Biden put into place are going to be long lasting, and some market mechanisms like the price of oil and gas are going to be impediments to Trump's efforts to expand energy.
Let's get to some of our questions. Ruslan, you had a question about Marco Rubio. Why don't you just come online and just you feel free to ask our panel, we'll go to the other questions from there.
Thanks, John. I think I will echo some of the questions that are asked in the Q&A panel. What do you think? Do you already have an idea, Aaron and Lee, about how does peace through strength look like, in particular as it relates to sanction? What we heard from President von der Leyen, for example, is that it seems that they immediately said, okay, we're ready to buy more US LNG. But that would seem to mean what we already get as a foretaste, in terms of the sanction of Gazprom Bank, which leads to, this would probably mean stopping the gas from flowing through Turk Stream, so sanctioning Turk Stream, which is the only line that will remain open. So do you think there might be, this peace through strength? What do you think will look like? And do you think it's likely to be like in NATO things? It's like Trump comes over and says, well, you guys get sorted out with sanctions and get rid of these Russian oil and gas and replace it with the US, and we can talk tariffs, we can talk further on. Thanks.
That's directed at me.
We'll start with you.
I think Ursula von der Leyen understands that Europe is negotiating from a position of weakness. And the LNG comment was the sort of first preemptive sally in that discussion. That weakness is going to be extremely difficult for the Europeans to overcome, in part because they're divided, and in part because so many European voters are already disenchanted with their own governments. As for what happens with specific flows of specific forms of energy, I don't know, and I'm not. I have no particular expertise in that area either, to be honest. But I think the fundamental underlying point is that Europe starts in a rather weak position vis-a-vis the United States, and Trump will be very eager to exploit that. So I would leave it at that.
Aaron, thoughts?
I have nothing. There was more information in Ruslan's question than I could provide in any.
Okay. Here, Aaron, is a question for you that asks you to probe the psyche of Donald Trump. Good luck with this. This is from Ryan McLaren. From all that I have heard of Trump's ego, I find it hard to believe the president-elect will enjoy hearing that he is Putin's puppet. Could this ironically benefit Ukraine? Could Trump become more hawkish on Putin to disprove these criticisms, or has peace plan limited, or his peace plan limit on Putin's maximalist intentions out of spite? In other words, we've heard this from other people too, which is, might he be embarrassed into doing the right thing?
I've never heard the word embarrassed and Trump go in the same sentence. I see it differently. Rather than Trump being afraid of being seen as Putin's puppet, Trump is the hero of every story that he enters. He's always the decider. He's always the hero. And he's the master of personal diplomacy. Only I can fix it. I will go to North Korea. I will talk to the North Korean leader. I will not rely on, panels of people sitting in conference rooms in Geneva to sort out North Korea. I have a great relationship with Xi. I have a great relationship with Putin. And I think that rather than being seen as Putin's puppet, he would build a narrative in which he's Putin's equal or superior, and in which leader to leader, he will fix the world's problems. he arranges and I mean, what do we do with Tulsi Gabbard being nominated to head all U.S. spy agencies? The reputation she carries with her is that she's Putin's puppet, and he was unabashedly putting her forward. So,
well, she's blamed the U.S. and NATO for forcing Putin to invade Ukraine.
right. And echoing, the Russian line on Ukraine and on other matters. So if he was able to be shamed into drawing more distance from Putin, the Tulsi Gabbard nomination doesn't, provide any evidence for that.
I agree. He's unembarrassable. However, he is very sensitive to any suggestion that he looks weak. The word weak is anathema to Donald Trump, always has been. And a deal in which Trump pushes the Ukrainians to cede territory, give up their ambitions ever to join NATO, and don't have any guarantees for security going forward would expose Trump very likely to charges that he looks weak, and not just from Democrats, by the way, but from hawkish, traditional national security Republicans. I think he's loath to be called weak, and so that he's going to face a choice. General Kellogg, retired General Kellogg, has kind of laid out that choice in a way, having said that, well, if Ukraine agrees to negotiate, then the United States should step in and arm Ukraine even more aggressively. Whether Congress would go along with that is a separate question. But as an incentive to help to get Ukraine to the table. And if Ukraine refuses to negotiate, then cut off arms. In other words, that's a kind of peace through strength that would require more arming of Ukraine. Now, whether Trump is willing to do that, I don't know. But if he cuts off weapons for Ukraine, if there's no additional arms flow once he takes office, and if Ukraine is put on even more on the back foot and forced to retreat even more and cede even more territory, and then the conversation in Washington becomes about Trump looking weak and sort of causing additional territorial losses in Ukraine, he might be vulnerable to the suggestion that Ukraine is becoming his Afghanistan. That's something I'm sure he doesn't want to hear. That's not to say that he cares about Ukraine per se. I don't think he does. And certainly J.D. Vance has said explicitly that he doesn't care about Ukraine, as well as other members of Trump's team. So, we'll see. I wouldn't predict which way that would fall, but the allegation of weakness, I think, is something that Trump is sensitive to.
Lee, and by the way, that point goes beyond. That goes beyond Putin. The more Donald Trump puts his personal prestige on the line by making every problem the one that only he can fix, and the more he downplays policy-making processes and collaborative processes, the more he has at risk. If only he can talk to North Korea, what happens if North Korea doesn't want to talk to America anymore? If only he can talk to Netanyahu, I don't imagine that. We'll have to see whether the U.S. continues to place the same emphasis on trying to get Israel to reduce the number of civilian wartime casualties in Gaza. I don't know if that'll remain as a priority for the United States, but Netanyahu pushed Biden around. We don't know yet what the Trump-Netanyahu relationship is going to be. And I just think in every sphere, the more Trump accrues power to himself and all decision-making to himself rather than on institutions or people around him, he has risk as well as prestige there.
Lee, it may be early. We don't know what Trump's policy is going to be to various sectors of the world. But this question from Yinda Keta, what do you think his stance will be on the Western Balkans, an important point for the EU's enlargement philosophy?
Well, I don't think Trump himself gives a whit or could find on a map honestly, the Western Balkans. You had Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who confused the Balkans with the Baltics just a year ago. So let's not credit Trump with too much foreign policy expertise that he doesn't have. More broadly, I think he's no friend of the European Unions. He's no friend of multilateral alliances. He's no friend of multinational institutions. And to the extent that the EU is struggling, I think that's fine with Donald Trump. He'd rather deal with European countries individually. If you go back and comb through everything Donald Trump has said about the European Union, it ranges from indifference to hostility. And so, the idea that he would want the European Union to grow stronger by enlargement, or extend European Union values, protections, rules to some smaller countries in the Balkans, I just don't think is on Donald Trump's radar, and not high up on his foreign policy team's radar either. I don't think the EU is something that Donald Trump values, and in fact, I think he and Putin sort of there's a sort of weird dovetailing of interests there. Putin, of course, would love to break it, and I'm not sure Trump would mind that much.
A question to both of you, or either of you, from Alina Tragub. In your opinion, is there any chance Trump will accept Ukraine into NATO after a ceasefire to prevent the continuation of the war?
No. I mean, sorry if I'm jumping in. Aaron, did you want to take that?
No, you spoke with such authority that I deferred.
The compromise that was struck at the last NATO summit in Washington last summer was the word irreversible. That Ukraine's membership in NATO would be irreversible. There was no time frame attached to irreversible. Who knows what irreversible might have meant one day, but it was certainly a signal to give hope to Ukrainians. And I think Donald Trump is very likely to yank that carpet from underneath the Ukrainians' feet. And also the Germans are not in favor of, for the time being at least, of any kind of membership in NATO for Ukraine. And so that leaves open the sort of question of how do you conduct negotiations to end a war in Ukraine, in which a key question, or probably the key question, is how to guarantee Ukraine's security going forward, how to ensure that there's no subsequent attack in 2 years or 3 years or sooner from the Russians. What are those security mechanisms and guarantees that Kiev will want and Europe will want for Ukraine? In the absence of NATO membership, that's a good question. And what is Trump going to come up with? And this question of Trump and Ukraine, and Aaron, to your point, that he alone can fix it, that he's the sort of indispensable character, the hero of every story, it kind of gets back to this dichotomy of whether we should take Trump seriously or literally. His allies tend to take him seriously, but not literally. His adversaries literally, but not seriously. So when he says that he's going to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, everybody was like, his adversaries were like, well, how's he going to do that? And his allies were like, oh, we're not taking that literally. He'll come up with a plan. I'm not so sure that Donald Trump knows what his plan is towards ending the war in Ukraine, but I do think that he would like to. I do think it's important to him because it is a force of such instability in the world, and it is such a potential drain on Western resources and potentially American resources if he can't disentangle. And so I do think this is going to be among the top priorities, if not the top priority in terms of foreign policy, come January 20th.
So we have just 2 minutes left, and I want to get to Konstantin Hirstov's question. How would Trump act toward the Middle East, its allies like Qatar and Israel, and its adversaries like Iran? What should we expect from Donald Trump on Mideast policy? Aaron, why don't we start briefly with you? We just have like a minute and a half left.
I actually would defer to Lee who has the better international perspective.
Lee.
So Trump comes into office with an enormous advantage, probably from his lights, which is that Iran is enormously weakened as a result of Israel's own actions. Israel's actions against Hezbollah, which is Iran's principal proxy in the region. Israel's bombing of Iran itself, which diminished and deteriorated Iran's own missile air defense. And so, Trump comes into office seeing Iran as, the most dangerous possible adversary, and yet a diminished adversary. Thank you very much, Bibi Netanyahu. So that's an advantage for Trump, and he'd probably like to press that advantage. So it's definitely a different tableau of global balance of power than he faced when he was last president.
To change that, take advantage of that new tableau by eliminating Iran's nuclear capability?
Well, you could argue that he took a step back from that last time around in ditching the JCPOA. This time around, he would certainly like to make sure that Iran doesn't seek nuclear weapons, and yet, in a diminished capacity, Iran might be more intent on doing that since it sees its other defensive mechanisms having been diminished. So, it's when a powerful country like Iran is diminished, that's a dangerous moment.
Lee, Aaron, thank you very much. Ruslan and the Center for the Study of Democracy, thanks very much for hosting this. And the audience, thank you very much for joining us today. Much appreciate your participation. And with that, our session concludes.